Hello and welcome back to the Out of Program podcast. Today we're joined by Dr. Jonathan King, a gastro, registrar, health tech founder, NHS clinician entrepreneur fellow and EWAR fellow. Drawing on his unique perspective as both a clinician and patient with a chronic disease, he is the founder and CEO of Medical Ease, a digital health startup tackling language and accessibility barriers in clinical care. Hi Jonathan and welcome to the show.
Hi Jing, thanks for having me.
Brilliant. So let's start with your early career. What drew you to medicine and what were those early few years like for you?
So I wanted to do medicine essentially from the age of 15. Medicine or nursing, I didn't know which one. And that was all related to my health conditions. So I've got cystic fibrosis, which strangely wasn't actually diagnosed till I was 9 because the genotype is slightly unusual. So the late diagnosis and the phenotype wasn't totally typical either, which is why I didn't raise any suspicions. And then, so my first admission was actually when I was 15, and I hadn't realized how unwell I'd become over the past year or two because, slow decline. And I was very resistant to going to hospital, quite scared. I guess it confirmed the label that I'd up to then kind of denied existed. I still felt normal, inverted commas. But then at the end of the admission, I felt like absolutely a new person. I was like, incredible. I can't believe I was actually that unwell. And it's thanks to everyone in, this ward, all the nurses, all the doctors. And discharge day felt like one of the best days of my life up to that point. So I thought, wow, what an incredible job that you can have an impact on somebody and pick them up as they're feeling the lowest, whether that's psychologically or mentally, and then send them off home feeling like a totally new person. I was like, that's what I mean, this is one of my favorite days so far in my life. They must have that regularly. I want to experience that. So that was the push where I was like, I'm going to healthcare. It's nursing or medicine. Either way, I bonded with the nurses. They were there with me every day. I didn't see the doctors as much, but I guess the buck stops with them, which is quite an interesting kind of skill set and stress. And so as I got older and I realized I quite like working under stress and feeling the responsibility of my decisions, I wanted to go into medicine at least. So that was my plan when I was picking my GCSEs the following year and then doing my A levels after that.
So you were basically inspired through your experience in the healthcare system, but then as you decided to pick medicine as your subject that you wanted to study, did you have any challenges with balancing your own health issues with the kind of rigors of the study and the practice?
The main challenge, initially at least, was actually external. So, like I said, the genotype I had meant that my phenotype actually came on a little bit later. It's now one of the common ones that is tested for this heel prick, but at the time it was unknown. So I've got the standard Delta F5. I've also got another slightly rarer one that comes from my mum's lineage, which means that the onset of the phenotype is later in your life. So I only developed pancreatic insufficiency when I was 17. I only developed recurrent chest infections when I was 15. I had good weight gain, good growth. I don't have the typical phenotype of somebody with CF, both visually but also functionally up to the age of about 15, 16. Then it proceeds at the same rate. So at the age of 15, 16, I've been into hospital once. I hadn't felt particularly unwell. I thought I could do everything as my friends could do. But my hospital, both Great Ormond Street and then my adult hospital when I transitioned, and my parents were really anxious about the idea of me doing medicine because it's such a vigorous course, which I didn't really understand because I was like, oh, I'm not, training to be an ultramarathon athlete. It's an academic course, so my brain is not affected by my CF. So why could I not do something that other, able people can do? So I found that a bit frustrating that nobody supported my application for medicine the first time round. So I made a compromise. I'd spent quite a lot of my teenage years, as most people do with a chronic disease, being quite resistant to external advice. And going into hospital, I'd resist it and I'd get like a bit stroppy and whatever. I was like, this is going to be one of the occasions where I don't kick up a fuss. What I'll do is I'll basically bargain. I'll say, look, you think I can't cope in higher education because I'll be too unwell. So why don't we make a deal that I do a 3-year degree? And if I can hack the 3-year degree, then you'll all support me in my application. Obviously, they said I could have applied first time round, but they just wouldn't have supported me. They'd have been too stressed. And I was like, I don't want really to do possibly a stressful course with your external stress on top. So let me do a bachelor's degree. If I deal with that, let me apply for medicine with your support. So that was kind of the external resistance and difficulty that I initially had to getting into medicine to
When you
answer your
say
question.
support, what do you mean by that? Is it the emotional support? Is it the blessing from the people? Or was there something a bit more to do with the application itself?
I think it was the blessing and the, if I prove to you I can do this, can you like not be stressed every day that I'm doing medicine?
Mm.
I don't want to feel like if I've got a cold or I do happen to get unwell, it becomes this whole, oh my God, you're not going to be able to. We told you this. And it's like, just if I can prove it on a smaller scale, and that's not to belittle bachelor degrees. I did one, so I obviously don't think badly of them, but it's a shorter degree. Then please just let me apply for medicine with you reassured. Let me reassure you I can do this, and then we can just proceed as though this conversation, this stress never happened and won't exist.
So then how did medical school and training go for you?
To be honest, it was okay. I finished the bachelor's degrees in 3 years. Any admissions I organized around leave, like half term, reading weeks and things like that. Same came for medicine. The degree itself, there's plenty of flexibility. I managed to do it in the same, 5 years. I didn't do the intercalated, so it's 5 years. Didn't take extra time, didn't have to resit any exams. Balancing that was okay. It was a bit harder during medicine itself as a job because the job is more intensive physically than the degree. The degree is not physically intensive. So that's why I never really understood why can I not do this degree. The job is a bit more physically intensive with nights and long shifts, etc. But my F1 I was full time and it went fine. I did have to go to hospital a few times, but I just sacrificed annual leave for going into hospital because I didn't want it to impact my training. And then I also at that point they introduced home intravenous antibiotics. So I'd be in hospital for like maybe a week, and then I'd finish the 3 course of antibiotics at home. I'd go into I'd have a PIC line generally. In my later years, I had a permanent. It's called a portacath, but basically like a Hickman line. And so I would just I would just ask the ward sister, like, look, at 2 o'clock, I'm going to have to use, if that's okay, I can use your office to shoot up some meropenem and colistin or tazocin. And I would just do my IVs whilst I was at hospital, but it therefore didn't impact my first year of training at least. As I progressed, I mean, my second year, I took a year out to work abroad in India for a charity. I'd fallen in love with India when I was on my elective, and the disparities out there for such a beautiful country really kind of struck me as quite sad. And I appreciated that it's a systemic issue and it's nothing that I can do. But nonetheless, I had a contact who worked in the charity in the slums for children who basically have malnutrition. I was like, oh, already knew at that point I wanted to be a gastroenterologist, and I already knew at that point I wanted to go back and like do something in India that was of value. And so I took a year out to go to India for that charity. And then I became very unwell whilst I was in India from CF point of view, not from like, GI point of view. And I was repatriated. I was in hospital for like 6 months, on NIV and oxygen, and referred to airfield for a lung transplant, actually, at that point. And so from there on in, I was talking about the external kind of barriers that existed from my parents and from my healthcare professionals. Then it became quite an internal barrier to work because I did become unwell at that point. And so from then on, my training, my time in medicine has been very different.
With an experience like that, at any point did you feel like you wanted to quit? Because you're still a gastroenterologist today. How
Mm.
did you overcome that? What were those emotions like?
So initially, when the external barriers were put up, it just made me want medicine more. It just made it feel like even more of the holy grail. And when I got there, it didn't disappoint. It wasn't one of those things that if you're overhyped, you get there, you're like, oh, well, it wasn't worth all that fighting, both, getting through it, but also having combats with people around you. It was like, this is you know, the absolute epitome of what I could be doing with my time. And that remained for quite a while. Like I absolutely loved the job. Post India, when it became physically difficult to do the job, it still was something that it was my life. It felt like that was what defined me. I had two labels, person with CF and doctor. And I loved being doctor because I wasn't person with CF when I was at work. I was, something that other people also was, and something that I'd always wanted to be. Post India, I mean, I didn't end up having a lung transplant, but I was very close to needing one. And I went back less than full time. And the way that I got so unwell so quickly, twice actually, I got unwell in India, then I got better, and then overnight, like I got unwell again. It took me about a year and a half to, it's not that I wanted to quit medicine, but I really struggled with the idea. I was in F2 and they were talking about, oh, you're going to apply for CMT, what you're going, I was like, I'm really struggling to plan here. You're asking me to make career plans. I don't even know whether I'm going to need a transplant again in a few months' time. For all I know, it's going to, my lung function was 30%. That's still transplantable. So I was like, you're asking me to make plans. I could get a cold this winter, be gone. Yeah, I was very dark. It was a very dark place. Thankfully, I had a great local TPD who would spend hours just listening to me, like in my apathy and my emo phase, and probably crying a little bit as well, or just angry. So at that point, yeah, it wasn't that I wanted to quit, but I was struggling to engage. But then I came out the other side, and then I knew that I wanted to do gastro, and I was starting to become less full than full time. So 60%, 80%, 80% on calls, 80% with full on calls, and then now full on calls and full day job. And yeah, and I was just like eager to kick on again until I then, a few years ago, took another rupee to go to New York. That was the next pivot point in my relationship with the career.
And that's an incredible story of resilience and drive. I think there are not many people who, having gone through such a significant health challenge, would still be so committed in their clinical career as you are. So, hats off to you for that. I just want to wind it back a little bit and I guess explore some of your interests and opportunities outside of clinical medicine, or rather adjacent to clinical medicine, early on in your career. You mentioned the journey to India to work for the charity, but you also did a couple of other non-clinical things as well. So do you want to elaborate on that for me?
Yeah, I think you're referring to Beam and Paxter initially, and then other things along the way. I think that was kind of a natural progression to the interests that I've had. So I struggled to do much extracurricularly because the way I saw it was I need to preserve my energy to do the work. And when I get home, I need to do as little as possible because I'm going to go back to work tomorrow. I want to be the best that I can be at work and not prove people wrong, but just keep proving that at work, I can be normal despite the fact that I'm very much less able than everyone else outside of the work environment. But having said that, I was very involved in medical education when I was in med school and then as a junior doctor. And then I think it kind of all came together. The Paxton Beam involvement, I believe, kind of came as an offshoot from the whole transplant saga where I almost needed the transplant. And the way I got off of the list was engaging in exercise. I was still on NIV and oxygen, but I'd kind of set myself an unnecessary, stubborn kind of challenge. I was like, right, if this is going to happen, if I'm going to get transplanted, and this is what my life's going to be like at 20, whatever I was, 20, I'm going to do it as someone who has raised money running 5K with an oxygen cylinder on my back. Like, I'm just going to do something that's just like that, again, that I shouldn't be able to do to prove to myself that I have more control over things in my disease. And in training for that 5K, which I didn't raise money in the end doing the 5K, but I was able to run 5K in the end. And I was able to run 5K at an okay pace, actually, without needing to pause, albeit without oxygen, actually. I think I got conditioned enough to be able to. But by the end of that kind of 3, 4 months of exercising, having been in hospital 6 months with every antibiotic under the sun, NIV, CPAP, whatever, constant physiotherapy, although my lung function didn't budge, my function was completely different, and I was taken off the transplant list. And I was like, wow, that is amazing. Like, how do we not know? Well, maybe we do, but how do we not really know that exercise is amazing? And why are we not pre-habilitating people rather than rehabilitating people and really engaging with this? And there was one morning where I'd gone on the same run that I'd been on the previous 3 days, but I wasn't able to complete it. But I was otherwise feeling totally myself. I said, that's a bit strange. So I contacted my physios and they got me in and we did a few tests and like, yeah, you're probably brewing something. Here's some oral antibiotics. Now, if I hadn't been going on the runs, I wouldn't have pushed myself to the extreme to like notice that slight drop off because I'd have just been, sedentary or walking around. And then I'd have only noticed the symptoms a lot later when I'd have probably needed hospitalization. I was like, this is surely, exercise not only picks things up earlier, it gets you stronger. Got me thinking about remote patient monitoring. I was like, why are we not, revolutionizing how we're doing medicine? So I'd had in the back of my mind, I was like, we need to do remote patient monitoring. We need to do remote patient monitoring. Algorithms that pick up subtle changes that tell why are we just randomly seeing patients every 6 months when, so that was kind of like sitting in the back of my mind. And then I really wanted to raise the awareness of the exercise. And that kind of went hand in hand with my whole medical education kind of background. I'd done, a few training courses and run a few courses myself that I'd, basically created from scratch. And so I ran a conference in Cambridge for 3 years out of 4, I think, where we brought in people who were involved in exercise and with chronic conditions to raise awareness about the importance of exercise. And so this kind of stream of using my educational background in a way, I suppose, to organize talks and give talks myself about exercise, then fed in nicely to what Paxter, which became Beam, were doing, which actually was co-founded by one of the physiotherapists who really supported me in wanting to get better and run that 5K. There was only 2 people who really supported me, Pam Scarborough and Charlotte Wells, my physiotherapist, and Pam was one of the co-founders of Paxter. And that's how I was kind of like looped into that, and I was engaged in wanting to help them grow a platform, which is basically exercise program, but suited and adapted for people with chronic conditions.
So you started off as, I guess, a stakeholder as part of that platform, but then
Yeah.
you started working on business development and strategic partnerships. So that's fairly unusual, for someone who is a clinician. How did that transpire?
So in 2020, other things happened other than COVID. I moved to New York 6 weeks before the COVID pandemic, met the other co-founder of Beam, who was working out from Brooklyn, and we got to talking, and they were starting to get some traction and wanted to raise some money, but they were still hitting some barriers with healthcare providers being reticent to uptake the new product and pay for the subscriptions. And I guess we just kind of like, I just shared a few thoughts based on having been a patient. So the barriers where you're not going to get patients engaging with this for this reason. And then my healthcare hat, why people aren't going to pay for it for this reason. And then also, I wouldn't say I'm like, I don't know whether I wouldn't say I'm innovative particularly, but I'm good at seeing problems and pitching ideas. So in medicine, I'm always quite good at running a quip or seeing a quip worth doing, not just like a bog standard boring quip, but a quip where it's like, oh, that's actually quite interesting. That could actually change things. And so I suppose from that kind of natural conversation, and I'm an ideas man. I'm not very good at following through the ideas and knowing what to do. I'd be a great number 1 who could then offload onto a number 2. So I guess from conversations with the co-founder, she's like, oh, that, it's a startup, so it's all hands on deck everywhere, but it'd be really interesting to have you kind of lead that. And with your background, you'd have a bit more gravitas with some of the people we're talking to. They might take us a bit more seriously. And so that's where the business development aspect and strategic partnerships came through with Beam. I was only there for a few months, because maybe 6 or 7, because the main reason I went to New York was actually to be stay-at-home dad. So once our daughter arrived, I left Beam, and we then left New York a year later. But those 6, 7 months were, good eye-opener to what startup life's like and what I can do in that environment.
And then I guess talking further about startups, you then go on to found a business yourself, which is Medical Ease. How did that come about? And where was it in, I guess, the health journey and the clinical training journey that you just described?
They kind of followed on quite well, chronologically quite well from my time at Beam. I found the time at Beam interesting. It was exciting to, grow something, and like I said, I like thinking about problems and concepts and tackling them and testing them. And so I was interested in going back into that space at some point in the future, but it was on the back burner. I was mainly a stay-at-home dad. During that 2020, 2021 in New York, obviously there was the COVID pandemic, and it was clear data coming out from everywhere in the world was that, non-native patients were getting worse treatment than native patients. Skin color played an impact, language barriers played an impact into how well people, survival rates, mortality. But I think in a way, more than that, in a very tangent manner, the Black Lives Matter movement really impacted me. We were in New York during a lot of the protests and rallies. We were in New York during the trial. We watched the actual judgment live. My wife is a person of color. My children are therefore people of color. A lot of my best friends are people of color. So I was very taken with that. At the same time, I was very aware not to be or come across as a white savior, but maybe because I had too much time on my hands, albeit I was the stay at home. I was like, I want to, in the same way that I wanted to go back to India and try to do something to help. I just felt like I wanted to do something in this space. So I spoke to a few friends, and one of my best friends who is Ghanaian by origin, but he's a British doctor. Like we were ideating, he was like, "But your position of power is medicine. So you've got to use where you are in medicine to implement this change that you want to bring in." And we ideated a few things, and I think I'm multilingual, and I've always been really pro learning languages, and I've always been, I try to learn a few key phrases for any patient on the ward who speaks a different language. Whenever I go abroad, I try to learn a few key phrases just to be polite and respectful. And so it kind of all came together that, okay, well, people, and I see it all the time. And at that point, I was like an ST3, ST4. So I've been consenting patients day in, day out. And if they don't speak English, the consent is just shocking. And even on the ward, like at the best of times, I feel like even English speaking patients don't get the communication that they would, should or deserve, the time that they should or deserve. And that's, it's purely a firefighting thing, but you can tell that certain patients are just totally lost in what's going on. If they don't speak English, again, it's like times, 100x. So that all kind of came together, and I was like, that's the solution. It's not a Black Lives Matter thing, but it's a kind of a non-white thing, I guess. It's a BAME solution. English speakers get terrible care, in my opinion, or at least perceived care, than English speaking patients. I need to build a solution that can solve that. And the technology was there, like, voice to text, even text to voice, rudimentary translation tools. It was all there. I was like, this just all needs to be brought together in the right place and in the right space to really make a difference in healthcare. And so that's my long-winded kind of, but there's multiple strands that ended up becoming intertwined, and then it created Medical Ease.
It's so interesting to hear the inspiration for the business and how it linked to your views on the Black Lives Matter movement and how that personally moved you. Talking a bit more then about how the business got started from that point of inspiration. What did that look like? How did you get from inspiration, idea, to trading?
So I mentioned I'm an ideas man. People don't believe me, but I thought of Uber before Uber existed. It was called Taxi Fare, and it was basically like an eBay version of hitchhiking. So it wasn't quite Uber, but I was like, I'm on the iteration. I'm on the iteration process. And actually, I went to Morocco the other day, and that app exists. It's not called Taxi Fare, it's called something else. But you can basically bid with drivers. They're like going to King's Cross, and you're like, I need to go to King's Cross. So that, okay, well, I'll take you for £10. Like, come on, I'm in Caledonia Road, take me for £3. And then you kind of meet halfway. And I was like, that's genius. And Taxi Fare, that's brilliant. And then I'd come up with like, when I was a toddler, 5 or 6, I came up with a shiwi. And I remember telling my dad, I was like, oh, because we were standing by the side of the road, passing urine, having pee. And I was like, oh, it's not fair that women can't do this. But if they had a funnel, they could do it. And my dad just laughed. I remember he's just like laughed. Now, it's not a multi-million, I'm not saying he's a unicorn. The person who founded Shiwi is a unicorn founder, but Shiwi is a thing that still existed. Washing machines at tumble dryers, that was me. They existed. I didn't know that they existed, but I feel like if you don't know it exists, then in your reality, you've just invented something.
You're a visionary.
Yeah. So, but ideas, out of my ears, if that's a thing. Also, just another one. I'll keep that one in the back burner because I haven't actually seen it in the stores yet. One day, maybe I'll create it. The So ideas was fine. I'd come up with ideas. So this was another one of my ideas, but it was again maybe because I had too much time on my hands. I finally actually decided to do the next thing, push it on because I never knew. It's great to come up with a washing machine that's a tumble dryer at the age of 8, but how do I make that at the age of 8, whether it exists or not? And if your dad laughs you out of the room about the shiwi, how are you going to start? But I need my dad's angel investment to start building the shiwi. So, but for the first time, I decided to actually carry through my plan. Again, a lot of my answers, I feel like the short answer is serendipity, but actually, I was listening to a podcast. It's one of the only ones I ever listened to, Trevor Noah podcast. I think it's great. A few weeks ago, it was probably before summer actually, he was talking to somebody and they were talking about different types of luck. There's dumb luck, which is just, you're born in the UK, so you are born into the environment that you're born in. You're born in sub-Saharan Africa, it's completely different. It's dumb luck, you can't do anything about that. There is luck of emotion, which is just, if you stay in bed, then you're not going to bump into someone, but that you can then strike up a conversation with. But if you get out of bed, you could have bad luck, you could stub your toe, so at least staying in bed you avoid that, but you could have good luck, bump into an old friend. And then there's luck of, I can't remember what it's called, but it's attention. Basically, you have to have your eyes open to see the opportunity to then maybe get lucky from the opportunity. You might have gone out to the coffee shop, but because you're on your phone, you didn't notice your friend across the road that you hadn't seen for years. So in all that being said, at the same time that I was thinking about, I want to do this, a pharmaceutical company and Guts UK were offering £10,000 for a quip in gastroenterology. And I can't remember how I came across it. I was like, oh, I mean, this will definitely win that. I just, for whatever reason, I was like, this will definitely win that. So I applied and it won that. And I got 10 grand. And I was like, 10 grand's perfect. That's how much you need to build an app. I got an award. I built an app. And then created the company off the back of that. So that, because I was worried about, I wanted to test it to go forwards in the quip. I got sign off from my clinical supervisor, and he was like, he loved it, and he was super clear. But as soon as it got to the, building stage, I was like, I'm not falling for this trip. This has to be not me as an NHS employee. So then I founded the company, and then it kind of was like a natural progression from there to build, iterate, start raising, trading, applying for accelerators.
So that's really interesting. You were inspired, you had the idea, and then you stumbled upon this funding pot through pharma that you won, and that was how you got going, which is very interesting. Now that the business is fully running, how has it been balancing your clinical commitments with running an early stage startup?
So I've not long after we started kind of plotting our pilots and building, I applied for an EP because I wanted to have some designated time just to focus on the company, because I was finding myself either working till 2 in the morning once my daughter had gone to sleep and going to work, or I was finding myself working at work I thankfully had a job that was quite relaxed. There was two registrars on, great CMTs. We weren't that busy of a ward. We had our own office. So in between clinic letters, I could steal like half an hour here, half an hour there. But I knew that I needed to, focus on it properly. So I asked for an OP. Mistake number one of like with this kind of like new trajectory was I didn't think they would offer me an OP or agree to my OP to work on my startup. And I thought they would be anxious that it was not a good use of time. And that would negatively impact my consultant applications. And at that point, I wanted to do hepatology, which is quite academic and everyone needs a PhD. So like, if I do this, I won't be able to get another OP to get a PhD. I won't be able to do that. There used to be at this point, the year that I took the OP, there was a national training number specifically for hepatology for 1 year. And to become a hepatologist, you basically had to do that. To do that, you basically had to have a PhD. So like, I need a PhD to get that, but I want to work on this. So I approached the prof that I worked with at St. Mary's with the remote patient monitoring idea that I said to you had been brewing in the back of my head for the last 10 years since I was unwell with my CF to work on a remote patient monitoring kind of PhD. And he was very interested, but there's no funding because it was my idea. So then I pitched that to my TPD and they were like, yep, that sounds fine. And then I was like, I also, kind of want to work on my startup. She's like, what's your startup? And I explained the startup. She's like, that's amazing. You could have just done that. Why do you want to do both? But by then I'd already had a few meetups with my prof and I didn't want to burn the bridges. So I was like, oh, well, obviously should have spoken to you first because that, would have been my ideal. But so I ended up I am still currently in my third year of a supposed PhD and work in my company, but because the PhD was not funded and it was something that we created out of nothing, we've only just got funding for this third year. We're only just getting through ethics now, so it's not going to end up being a PhD, which I'm fine about. I don't want to do hepatology anymore anyway, so I want to do luminal, which doesn't necessarily require a PhD, and I still think it'll be a good project and relatively innovative. And so, yeah, I found that I haven't had to balance clinical work, but for the majority of it, but I haven't really had only that to focus on, and that is quite difficult, especially because in a PhD where you're not funded, or research where you're not funded, and the startup where you're not making money, and it's fine if you're unattached, but we have two kids now. My wife works in private equity, so she's super busy all the time, travels abroad a lot weekly. At some points, it was like 4 multiple weeks. I don't feel like society allows me, and maybe it's more reflection on me than society, to place something of high significance if it brings no financial value or impactful value. And so, although I was working on one startup and my clinical research, and I'm working on another business, and I, used to work as a GI bleed on call for the first year and a half to get some money. That was the only one that paid me, and it wasn't much. And the other three didn't pay me much. And so it's very difficult for me to prioritize that over anything. And so you lose a lot of time despite having this dedicated time for, 2 or 3 things, but I lose so much time not prioritizing it because, I don't know, for me, it was difficult. I didn't feel like society or I respected what I was doing because it was just kind of like hobbies. If each one was bringing 100,000, then suddenly you're like, oh yeah, I'm super important. I've got to focus on these things. But it's like, oh, I'm just like having fun, working from home, doing my own little thing. And so I found that balance also difficult. You're starting something that isn't bringing money. You might be balancing a few things to make up for the fact you're not bringing money. Didn't carve out the right niche. I didn't just focus on one thing. So it wasn't so much balancing with clinical work. That's still to come next year, which will be great. It was more just balancing multiple projects and the lack of validation for it being worth time, if that makes sense.
It's interesting what you say, and I think it's very tactical what you're describing, because just going back to your earlier point around your out of program experience, you recognize the constraints that you were under because you were debating the possibility of needing a PhD to progress into hepatology, but you also had this desire to work on your business. So in some ways, it's really good hustle to be able to try and combine those two things together. And of course, what ended up happening was that it didn't transpire that way. I mean, it would have been beautiful if you could both do your PhD and grow the business. But I think it's a really great point for the audience as well in how you solve this problem. And of course, then in subsequent months or years, you face the classical problem, which is the trade-offs. And it's that whole point of there are many exciting things to work on. You have a plethora of opportunities, but of course there are some things that pay the bills and there are some things
Yeah.
that don't. And you're essentially trying to navigate opportunities where you can carve out more time or do things simultaneously. But then, of course, you may not be prioritizing it as much as the things that actually pay the bills or the things that are more structured. And I think that's probably something that a lot of the audience will be thinking about as they navigate their own careers. Because the beauty of a clinical pathway is that there is a lot of time depending on the specialty. You know, in your case, as you know, as when you were in gastro training, 2 registrars meant that, yes, you could, carve out a bit of time here and there to get some lift. But I think what I'm hearing from you is that maybe not so much frustration, but more the consideration of, well, if you don't dedicate enough time to it, then it may not truly take off. But at the same time, there are all these other kind of synergistic opportunities that you're also balancing in which then feed into your venture. But these are, I guess, all the trade-offs that are swirling in your head. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I do think this is something that a lot of medics will feel though, is that everything almost feels like everything that you do in medicine. And then you know what? It's not just medicine. I'm saying medicine because it's a medical podcast and people listening are probably going to be in medicine. A lot of this is professions. I don't like to sound elitist when we say medicine as though it's special. Like a lot of professionals will feel like if you're dedicating or taking time on anything, you need to have a tangible and noticeable output or result from it. So I've taken 3 years out, I've got a PhD. That's like a noticeable achievement. Taken 3 years out, my startup's now like turning 500,000 a year. Like you feel like every step you take has to definitely be an incremental, if not exponential leap forwards. Otherwise, you've taken the wrong step and it was not worth, you know, almost like a negative step or a neutral step. And it's like, actually, in a lot of other professions, they're a bit better at appreciating the experience that you get from it and the skills that, yes, it's not on a diploma, but you still have got skills from doing what you've done, which is transferable to something else. And it still creates an interesting employee and future, leader. But I struggled with the whole, well, if I'd taken these 3 years and I don't have a PhD, and I've taken these 3 years and my company hasn't exited or isn't turning off over enough money that I can go part-time and make money elsewhere, then I've wasted 3 years. I've lost time. And that's a difficult mindset to break. I feel like it is the medical environment and similar, I'm sure, to other specialties and other fields where everything has to succeed to be net positive in any increment, and anything else is just, a waste of time. And also something that you said during that just now was focusing on multiple things rather than one. I think that is a classic startup issue where you're ideating and you're solving problems and you think it's problem A, but people are saying it's problem B, and with a slight tweak it could be problem C. And you're like, well, actually, if we're doing those three, you might as well do the other four problems. And it's a lot of scattergun approaches. It can very easily become a scattergun approach when you're starting up and you're trying to ideate and solve. And I think I did that on the macro and the micro. I've done it in medicalese as well. And there really is an importance in just being a bit cleaner and focused, still being lean enough that you can move when you need to, but not trying to just chuck a net out and see what it catches, but actually, be a little bit more prescriptive in how you approach your problems. And I think that's certainly something that startup world's taught me, but also this whole experience of trying to wear too many caps and balance too many things has taught me. Everyone was like, "You're crazy. You won't be able to do both," which is never something good to say to me because then it's like, okay, I will definitely do that now. I used to say I'm going to do this, and my backup is that I'll get a PhD out of it. And people are like, that's nuts. You could like that can't be your plan B is getting a PhD. And I was like, okay, cool, challenge accepted. Turns out they're right because maybe out of my hands. And the irony is there is no national number for hepatology anymore, and I don't want to be a hepatologist, so I definitely didn't need to have done this clinical research. Other than it has been eating away at me for the last 10 years that we don't do enough remote patient monitoring, and so I'm still pleased to try to take a chunk out of that and maybe change that in some way, in a small way.
We come more now to present day, and one of the things that I want to draw attention on is your fellowship with EWAR. So for those listening, this is a prestigious European accelerator. What was the process of becoming a fellow? How did you find that?
Honestly, uh, that was a combination of all the three types of luck put together, I suppose, that I was talking about. I'd just been rejected. Had I just applied or just been rejected? Either way, I just applied for the SMART grant, which I ended up being rejected for, which I later found out when I spoke to Don Pimenta that he also got rejected for it by the same percentage that I got rejected for it. And look at Tortoise now. So I was like, oh, great, like good company to keep. But I therefore had like a massive application process, like about my startup ready to go. And I was in my kitchen scrolling on LinkedIn, which I don't often do. I can't remember what I was looking for. And then this like advert for EWAR fellowship came up. I was like, okay. I never heard of EWAR. I had no idea what it was. But I was like, it's useful to get. I think I must not have been rejected from my smart grant at this point. Thought it was probably useful to just keep getting feedback on my idea. Like, yeah, everyone I talk to say it's a great idea, but that's not helpful because they probably, also just like me. But also, and I think it's a great idea because it's my idea, so that's not helpful. So I just want feedback. Yeah, cool. Copy, paste, send. Didn't really think anything about it. Like, double check that EWAR was vaguely legit, and some of the people were legit because like maybe they're just early startup. I feel like everyone's paranoid. Everyone's going to take your idea and become a unicorn, and you'll be left there being like, that was me. And so I had a little bit of that paranoia, but then everyone checked out and EWAR was a thing. So I was like, yeah, copy, paste, send. Didn't really think anything about it. Got an interview. I was like, okay. Interview was a whole day. Really fun. I thought there was like psychometric tests and business analysis tests and logic tests, and then a group work that was all recorded and as an invigilator, see how you interacted with everyone and problem solved, and to build a business, and then different things happen throughout the hour or two you were with the group, and then interview with a previous fellow and an interview with one of the board members on the same day, and then you were invited to have a second round meeting with the founder the following week, and then you're offered a place. And I didn't think anything about it because I didn't know how prestigious EWAR was at the time. So I was just rocking up and doing my thing quite relaxed. And I fortunately got in. I think I probably wouldn't have performed as well if I'd realized, at the time, I think it was like 0.2 or 3% got in when I applied, and now it's like 0.01% or something crazy. Like the applications are just like nuts now. Unfortunately, I applied the year before they started to offer funding on the front door. They'll fund you when you leave the fellowship if they like your idea, but they currently are funding people straight off the bat if you accept joining now. So I missed out on that, which was a shame. Yeah, so that was kind of a combination of three pieces of luck, dumb luck and luck of motion and luck of awareness that I applied and got in. And that was a great experience, and at least for that period of time made me feel as though I was doing something productive for my startup as well, because it's like quite relatively intense, but something you can definitely balance alongside other things. 2 or 3 calls throughout the week, including mentorship calls and kind of webinar calls and then group work calls. So yeah, that was a great experience and a great community network to be still part of it. It's been like 2 years now, and I'm still totally have a weekly call with them. If I want, I'm still on the Slack channel. You can ask people for help, advice. They've got loads of resources that they offer you. People, the board still know you by name, still know what you're doing. My mentor still reaches out like twice a year to see what's going on. So really warm community I wasn't expecting, to be honest. Like coming from medicine, going into like the business entrepreneurial world, I thought it was all super cutthroat, this whole paranoia that people stealing your ideas or just there to make you feel small. Actually, it was like the warmest environment I've ever like experienced.
Yeah, and it's so important, especially when you're going on this kind of journey, to have that community and to have people on a similar journey with a shared experience, especially with the backgrounds that we've come from, as
Mm.
clinicians. It can be very hard. We weren't exposed to these kind of people early on. So I can see, and it sounds like you've had a great experience from that, and it was super helpful in your own startup journey as well.
As long as they don't succeed too much. There's one kid, Ariel, who's like raised loads time, like multiple times over, and is like properly running a company. And so you're like, damn man, what did I do that was so rubbish compared to Ariel? Why is that? Like, I'm glad that he's a lovely guy. I'm really glad that he's. You're like, man, I'm just like useless. So as long as everyone else doesn't succeed too well, yeah, the community is great. But if you're the only one trailing behind, then you're like, oh, that's just I definitely could have done without that community.
Comparison is the thief of joy, as somebody once told me. Anyway, we're running out of time now, so last couple of questions for you. For those clinicians that are listening, looking to do their own kind of alternative careers or stepping away from the traditional path, what advice would you give them?
So, I mean, I think the inferred advice from before, from previously, is probably obviously to make sure you've got the dedicated time and maybe the identity of what you once were, a doctor, somebody who makes money. You need to be able to kind of shake that and be okay with the fact that you're going to be a nothing until you're something. Being an entrepreneur is like, are you an entrepreneur until you've succeeded? I don't know. Are you just like somebody with an idea doing something fun? That's something that my wife would call me an entrepreneur. Her friends would call me an entrepreneur. Nah, until I make money, I don't think I'm an entrepreneur. Right? I'm just like somebody doing something and like having fun. So maybe that's a mindset thing that if you have that, great. If you don't, you need to work on that. But like two more tangible, useful pieces of advice, I suppose, would be one, go into something where you're not dependent on someone else. So I am the ideas man, great number one, but I don't have the technical skills to code an app or to use AI as I want to. So I'm dependent on someone else. So then I need to get a co-founder who needs to buy into it as much as I do. And they obviously won't buy into it. They want, you know, things to happen quicker, get money quicker, be paid. That's difficult. So if you're going to go into something, then either go into something where you have the skills, upskill yourself so that you do have the skills, or go into it with somebody who's basically just as committed and keen as you are, but has the required skills to progress. And then if you can, tangible, useful advice number two is avoid healthcare, or at least avoid the NHS as your customer, because that is honestly, both of my businesses are currently dependent on the NHS, really. Have potential other pivots for medical ease, but I really want to get this out to the masses. And it's just like so difficult because it's so cash strapped, it's so broke. I go to conferences where they talk about how innovative and progressive the NHS is, and I'm like, I don't see that as an entrepreneur or a doctor, actually. This is definitely some kind of smoke being blown up somebody's backside because it's just such a slow kind of just massive institution. There's no obvious way in, and then other things will happen. You're like, how did that happen? Where did that pot of money come from? Why are they funding that? It's so opaque, such a slow Goliath that if you can avoid selling to the NHS as a customer, that you're already miles ahead of other startups.
Wish you'd given me that advice 10 years ago.
And everyone said it to me, but I was like, no, but I'm a doctor. I'll talk to them and they'll get me in the room. Like it's a thing that's happening.
Classic.
I might talk to more people, but I just get more no's that way.
Well, fantastic. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining me, Jonathan. And for those listening, if you like what you hear and want to support the show, please do like and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever podcast platform you're currently listening to us on. It would mean a lot to me and it would help us spread the message to others exploring alternative paths. Thanks for joining us and see you next time. Bye bye.